Last time, we talked about the intense conflict between the Liaoning Aircraft Carrier Battle Group and the U.S. Reagan Aircraft Carrier Battle Group. The commander of the Reagan Battle Group, Rear Admiral George Wikoff, was so overwhelmed by a series of sudden incidents that he was ready to burn bridges and flip the table on us. The details of what happened are quite complex, and you can check the previous episode for that. I won't repeat it here. At this point in the timeline, it's the evening of May 11, 2022. We've already discussed in previous episodes how, since late April, the USS Abraham Lincoln had positioned itself just south of the Liaoning's exercise area. The Liaoning's exercise zone was about 100 nautical miles southeast of Taiwan, while the Lincoln was roughly 200 nautical miles from the southernmost point of the Philippines, in the southern part of the Philippine Sea. Besides the Lincoln, the carrier battle group included the Ticonderoga-class missile cruiser USS Cape St. George, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers USS Momsen, USS Spruance, USS Halsey, and USS Sterett. There was also a nuclear-powered attack submarine, though I couldn't find specifics, since the movements of submarines are usually highly classified. In addition to these vessels, the Lincoln Battle Group had another player, the electronic reconnaissance ship USS Lorenzen, which we discussed in earlier episodes. The Lorenzen had been called in to deal with our 815 electronic reconnaissance ship. If you've forgotten, go back 3 episodes. At that time, the Lorenzen was incredibly impressive. It managed to jam our 815 almost instantly, but there wasn't much we could do about it, as the Lorenzen is the most advanced electronic reconnaissance ship in the world. It's equipped with a phased array radar right on the ship's body. Even though our 815's radar was out of commission, we didn't run. We just kept following the Lincoln Battle Group at a distance not too close, but not too far either. There wasn't much the Lincoln could do about it either. They couldn't just sink it, especially since hostilities hadn't fully broken out yet, and there were still talks about freedom of navigation, so the Lincoln's commander, Bowen Smith, didn't pay it much mind, only ordering the Lorenzen to continuously electronically suppress our 815, jamming it with high-powered electromagnetic waves. Whether the radar was working or not, they just kept bombarding it with waves. If you've ever worked with radar, you'd know how it feels. Being exposed to high-powered radar beams can cause static on your skin, a prickly sensation. Over time, it could even damage your DNA and cause cancer. That's why the Americans deliberately bombarded our 815 with strong electromagnetic waves. But we didn't react. We just kept following them for over 20 days, up until May 10th. At that point, both the Lincoln and Reagan started a pincer movement against our Liaoning carrier group. The Lincoln immediately dispatched the missile cruiser USS Cape St. George, followed by the destroyers USS Spruance, USS Halsey, and another Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, directly toward the Liaoning battle group, closing the distance to about 300 nautical miles. Every move the Lincoln made was under the watchful eye of our 1,000-hand Guanyin system. As soon as the Lincoln made a move, our Liaoning battle group immediately dispatched the Type 055 destroyer Nanchang, which advanced 100 nautical miles to engage. Now, let me explain to technical details here. First, how does our 1,000-hand Guanyin system monitor the Lincoln's every move? Well, it's a pretty advanced technology, part of our Golfin special engineering project. What's the Golfin project, you ask? It's one of 16 major scientific projects that we launched in 2006, aimed at creating a high-resolution Earth observation system, essentially satellite surveillance. It's not just real-time surveillance, the resolution is also extremely high. If the resolution wasn't good, it would just look like a bunch of pixels, right? Globally, only the US and we have this level of technology, no one else does. Some people might mention Europe, but they're talking about remote sensing satellites, which are decent, but they can't form a network. What does that mean? Well, satellites orbit the Earth, and unless they're in geostationary orbit, they can't provide continuous coverage of one area. To maintain surveillance over a specific area, you need multiple satellites working together in a network. If you only have one or two, you're just dealing with reconnaissance satellites that pass over intermittently. Instead, they'll refer to them as low-orbit optical remote sensing satellites. These are often discussed on our agricultural channels because they're used to prevent crop diseases and pests. They can spot locusts from space or detect forest fires just as smoke starts rising. They're also used to monitor land usage, such as the protection of farmland boundaries. Even in smaller cities in China, if you try to build a house on farmland, land enforcement officials will be on your case the next day, likely ordering you to tear it down. And why? Because these satellites make everything crystal clear. These satellites are so advanced that they give us a God's eye view of everything happening. Our GOFN satellites are better than the US's real-time surveillance network, but we don't really advertise this. These satellites are also integrated into our 1,000-hand Guanyin system, giving us full control over everything happening in the Pacific. Some people just love to argue and nitpick. I once did a show on GOFN satellites, and someone in the comments said, "If your satellites are so great, why haven't you found Malaysia Airlines Flight 370? It's been years. These kinds of trolls aren't looking for a serious discussion. If they were, they could easily look up the fact that GOFN satellites started launching in 2015, and the MH370 incident happened in March 2014. That's why I don't respond to such comments. They're not worth the time. Now, let's get back to the second technical point. Why did we send the Type 055 destroyer Nanchang to engage instead of launching our carrier-based aircraft to fight the Lincoln? That's because the Liaoning still isn't up to the task. Why? Because ever since it was built, it's been designated as a training carrier. Its role was always intended to be that of a teacher, not a fighter. As China's first operational aircraft carrier, the Liaoning's origins lie in the Soviet Navy's Admiral Kuznetsov-class carrier, known as the Varyag. It was built in the late 1980s, but construction was halted due to the collapse of the Soviet Union. With no money to continue, the incomplete ship sat in a shipyard for over a decade, until we purchased it in 1999. It took 3 years just to transport it home. In April 2005, our Navy resumed construction and began modifications, with the goal of using it for scientific research and training. It wasn't until September 2012 that it was officially named the Liaoning. Our Liaoning, you could say, has had quite a rough journey. When we took it over and began refurbishing it, it had already spent over 20 years exposed to the elements in Ukraine, with no maintenance at all during that time due to the country's economic situation. So when we brought it back for repairs and upgrades, even though we installed some of the world's top-tier electronic systems, the fundamental structure was still what it was. From the day it was commissioned, we never intended for it to go toe-to-toe with the US. Instead, its main purpose was to quickly train carrier personnel and serve as a technological reserve. You have to understand, for our country, building aircraft carriers is now incredibly easy. If we ramped up production, we could match the US in numbers within a year. And no, this isn't any exaggeration. You should know that 80% of the world's shipbuilding capacity is in our country, with another 14% in South Korea. The US and Japan combined only account for 6%. So, our current shipbuilding capabilities far surpass what the US had during World War II, even when they set the record of launching one aircraft carrier after another. Back then, many ships were built to simply boost numbers, but for us now, building one carrier a month should be no problem. Once the war machine starts, costs are no longer a concern, and industries across the board get orders, so everyone has work. But let's not dive into wartime economics today. Don't think I'm exaggerating. Let me give you one key fact. There are only 4 shipyards in the world capable of building large aircraft carriers, and these are the Newport News Shipbuilding in the US, the Rosyth Shipyard in the UK, which, by the way, imports its gantry cranes from us, and the other 2, well, those are ours, Dalian Shipyard and Jiangnan Shipyard. Pay attention, we are talking about large carriers, those over 50,000 tons. Only 4 shipyards in the world can build them. A single large gantry crane limits 99% of the world's shipyards because installing a carrier's island requires one. But let me stay on topic. The real reason I tend to digress is to explain basic knowledge. Some people lack foundational knowledge, and because of that, they struggle to accept certain conclusions. In short, our Liaoning was never meant for fighting, it's a carrier for training. That's why, as we discussed in the last episode, when the US was spying on our Liaoning, they saw us training a whole shipload of rookies in takeoff and landing drills. That's the reason, plain and simple, we're not bluffing. This also explains why the Liaoning let our Type 055 destroyer advance 100 nautical miles ahead to confront the USS Lincoln. Liaoning itself isn't built for combat. So when the Nanchang 055 class destroyer received its orders, it went full throttle towards the Lincoln carrier strike group, which at the time was about 300 kilometers due south of us. Yes, 300 kilometers, not nautical miles. The Nanchang charged head-on, alone, into the fray. Some people questioned if the Nanchang was fearless or just reckless. But the truth is, this 055 destroyer was designed to fight. It's not a defensive ship. It's an offensive one, what they now call an arsenal ship. The Nanchang's hull is stealth-designed, and it was racing 100 nautical miles ahead when it ran into the USS Cape St. George, a guided missile cruiser, with two ships following close behind, the USS Sullivans and USS Halsey. They were tasked by the USS Lincoln's commander, ADM Burnsmith, to assist the USS Reagan from the northeast in surrounding our Liaoning. But things took a turn when they faced our Nanchang head-on. The captain of the Cape St. George must have thought, wait, isn't that a Type 055? What's it doing here instead of staying with the Liaoning, and it's charging at us alone? They realized they had to intercept it, as they were only 120 kilometers away from their commander, well within missile range. The Cape St. George tried to cut off the Nanchang by moving diagonally. This maneuver is a standard intercept tactic, forcing the opponent to turn. Once a 10,000-ton Type 55 turns, it loses momentum and becomes vulnerable. The Cape St. George approached from the Nanchang's front left, but the Nanchang didn't even blink, no slowdown, nothing. The captain of the Cape St. George must have panicked, thinking, this guy's serious. I'm only 8,000 tons, he's over 12,000. If we collide, I might die for sure. So, the Cape St. George slowed down, but our 055 suddenly sped up, slipping past their bow so closely that it nearly scraped the paint. The Cape St. George's crew was left dumbfounded, as they could see into our 055's bridge windows from just 30 meters away. Inside, at the helm, was a young woman in her 20s who gave the Cape St. George's crew a smirk as if to say, you bunch of cowards. The crew on the Cape St. George was furious. The captain, now embarrassed, ordered a pursuit. But his first officer quickly pointed out, Captain, we can't catch them. That 055 must have been doing at least 35 knots, and we're only capable of 30. After a long silence, the captain reconsidered, realizing how fearless the Chinese sailors must be. He figured his chances weren't great, and with a high likelihood of failure, his wife might even remarry. So, he gave the order to pursue the Nanchang anyway, knowing they couldn't catch up but wanting to show the right attitude of confronting challenges head-on. Alright, let's not dwell on how the Cape St. George turned around or how it started chasing. Let's continue with the Nanchang ship. The Nanchang swiftly moved in a straight line towards the USS Lincoln. Seeing the Nanchang breaking through Cape St. George and coming straight at her with only 120 kilometers left, the USS Lincoln's commander, Burnsmith, didn't panic at all. People in high positions aren't ordinary. She's naturally tough, and if you search for her pictures online, you'll see that in her face. With a cold smile, she gave orders, USS Sepp and USS Halsey, no matter what, you must stop the 055 destroyer. If it dares to break through, sink it. Also, order the two F-35C and EA-1HE Growlers to immediately attack. It was a kill order, meaning they were going to go after our Nanchang. The two F-35Cs took the lead because they are stealth aircraft, and stealth jets always take the first wave. Each F-35C carried two GSM anti-ship missiles in its bay, manufactured by Kongsberg in Norway. These missiles are 4 meters long, weigh 470 kilograms, have a top speed of 0.9 Mach, and a maximum range of 200 kilometers, but only if air-launched. Their capabilities, about what we had 20 years ago. But that's the best the US missile technology has to offer. Some might wonder why the US isn't using its Harpoons and is relying on Norwegian missiles instead. Well, the F-35 can't carry Harpoons, and frankly, Norwegian missile design is better. It's enough to deal with 99% of the world's navies, but today they ran into the 1%. As the F-35s approached our 055, their radar warning systems went off before they could even lock onto us. They had been locked on by the 055. The two F-35 pilots were puzzled. Aren't we supposed to be stealthy? How did they lock onto us? This doesn't make sense. They didn't know that our O-55 destroyer was equipped with a meter-wave phased array radar. Remember our ground-based GY-27 meter-wave phased array radar that we've used to spy on US bases for nearly 10 years without their knowledge? That's the tech in play here. The F-35s couldn't fire their anti-ship missiles because, once stealth is compromised, launching their subsonic missiles would be useless. The O-55 destroyer has HQ-10 close-range missiles, specifically designed to target threats within 10 kilometers, so any attempt would be futile. They feared that if they provoked the O-55, none of their 6 planes would make it back. Then the F-35 pilots radioed the A-1AG Growlers. "What are you standing around for? We're locked on. You're the electronic warfare planes. Do your job and jam their fire control radar so we can escape." But the 2 Growlers just hovered, unresponsive, as if they were possessed. From 120 kilometers away, Bournemouth had completely lost communication with the A-1AGs. Meanwhile, the FA-180 Super Hornet reported back to USS Lincoln. The 2 Growlers are acting strange, not responding at all. They're circling the O-55 and even diving at it. The O-55 had even opened its missile hatch. The Super Hornet reported that just as one of the Growlers finally broke its silence, "Commander, we need to retreat. The O-55 has YJ-1 ballistic anti-ship missiles. I lost connection to our data link, and now the O-55 is talking to me. It invited me to come closer and see what's inside its missile bay. I did, and it's loaded with YJ-1 missiles. I think it wanted you to see them too." When Bournemouth heard that, she was terrified. YJ-1. "I thought there wasn't a ship-launched version yet. How is that possible?" To give some context, in 2022, the ship-launched version of the YJ-21 hadn't been revealed to the world. Back then, everyone only knew about the air-launched variant, and the world was still debating whether a ship could even carry such a large missile, but now Bournemouth had seen it firsthand. The YJ-1 is one of only 2 ballistic anti-ship missiles on the planet, and yes, it's a ballistic missile worlds apart from what other countries have. Some might argue that the Houthis have something similar, but theirs is just a modified HQ-2, not a real ballistic anti-ship missile. Our YJ-1 has a range of 2,000 kilometers and hits speeds of Mach 10 at its terminal phase, which is 3.4 kilometers per second. This missile wasn't designed just to take out aircraft carriers, it could easily target something far more formidable. Now, knowing the O-55 had YJ-21s and could interfere with her Fleet C4 data network, Bournemouth decided that the Nanchang destroyer had to be stopped before it got any closer. If it fired those YJ-21s, it would obliterate the entire carrier strike group, and there'd be no way to defend against them. So, with grim determination, she ordered the USS Lawrence to use its massive X-band radar to knock out the 055's fire control radar, giving the F-35s a chance to strike. This was a bold and ruthless move, but as the saying goes, a woman's fury is more deadly than a man's. As the Lawrence powered up its X-band radar, preparing to send an electromagnetic pulse toward the O-55, there was a sharp crackle, and the Lawrence's radar emitted a plume of smoke. Simultaneously, the alarms on the Lincoln sounded, indicating that the carrier itself had been locked onto by hostile radar. Bournemouth was furious. She looked out and saw, not far away, our 815 electronic reconnaissance ship, the Tianquan 795, its radar now fully operational. What happened next? We'll cover that in the next segment.